I've played a lot of modded Minecraft, and while I really enjoy mods that completely rewrite the game, sometimes it doesn't even feel like I'm playing Minecraft anymore. That's exactly where Apotheosis shines. It adds a ton of crazy content that's not just insanely creative and packed with powerful features, but does so in a way that still feels grounded in vanilla mechanics. Apotheosis is available for Minecraft 1.21, but it's actually been around since 1.12. Somehow I only recently started diving into it on my playthroughs, and let me tell you, this mod is crazy, and honestly, borderline broken at times. Welcome back to Mod Labs, where we take mods and put them to the test by diving into new features, discovering new tips, tricks, and most importantly, having some fun along the way. In the next 40 minutes, I'll do a full showcase of Apotheosis, breaking down all of the major features and items across 5 sections: spawners, enchanting, adventure, gear, and utilities. With so much to cover and so little time, we better jump straight into it. What better place to start than with Apotheosis Spawners? Apotheosis adds all kinds of features that allow you to take complete control over vanilla mob spawners to build insanely powerful custom mob farms. The first and probably most important feature is that you have the ability to pick up and move spawners wherever you want by using a Silk Touch enchant on a pickaxe. It does do 100 durability damage to that pickaxe each time you break a spawner, but that means nether fortresses become a spawner gold mine to get tons and tons of spawners for you to use in farms around your base. Additionally, when broken, these spawners retain all of their data, including mob type and any spawner stats. Now, blazes are cool and all, but I don't just want to farm a bunch of blaze rods. So of course, you can always use mob eggs to change a spawner to the corresponding mob. Normally, you wouldn't really have a way to get mob eggs, except cheat them in. But one of the enchants I'll cover later in the enchanting section gives you a very easy way to get them. Or of course, if you have the mod mob grinding utils, you can explode a chicken to get one too. We're not done yet, because Apotheosis allows you to modify these spawner stats with items, including not just adjusting the vanilla Minecraft stats like spawn count, spawn delay, and spawn range, but also some Apotheosis modifiers like the ability to remove mob AI, ignore spawning conditions, or even the ability to control spawner spawning with redstone. To apply these modifiers, you right-click a spawner with a specific modifier item, which consumes the item and adjusts the stats. Some modifiers allow you to apply multiple times up to a specific stat cap. And if you ever make a mistake, you can use quartz in your offhand while using the modifier item to invert the effect. So for instance, a piston, which normally increases spawn radius by 1 block, will now decrease spawn range by a block with nether quartz in the offhand. Of course, mod packs have the ability to change these items, or even add custom stats or controls. But let's quickly run through each of these different stats and what the default modifier items are. Starting with the vanilla stats, you can increase the speed of spawns both by using sugar to decrease the maximum spawn delay down to 20 ticks or 1 second, as well as clocks to decrease the maximum spawn delay also down to 20 ticks. Using fermented spider eyes, you can increase the spawn count of each spawning operation up to 16 mobs per spawn. You can also use gas tiers to increase the mob cap of the maximum allowed nearby entities, allowing the spawner to continue spawning mobs even if there's a big pool of mobs below. Prismarine crystals can be used to increase the range that a player must be in respect to the spawner for mobs to spawn. And as mentioned before, you can always increase the range of the spawner using pistons, allowing you to spawn mobs in up to a 32 by 32 block square around the spawner. Hey, Future Reese here. Hopefully you've been enjoying the video so far. If so, I would really appreciate if you would subscribe to my channel. In fact, based on my channel statistics, less than 2% of the people watching this are subscribed. So come on, help me out a little bit, and let's see if we can achieve my goal of 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year. And if you're interested in some live playthroughs of all kinds of different mod packs, check me out on Twitch at MCTCReese, where I'll have a very special sneak peek at a new highly anticipated mod pack coming soon. Now for these special Apotheosis features, which there are a lot of. First, you can make your spawner controllable with redstone by using a redstone comparator. This means that you'll need to apply a redstone signal to the spawner for it to spawn any mobs, which is great for adding on and off switches to the farms, which you'll definitely need if you're playing on any servers. And hey, here's a tip. Create redstone links are great for this, allowing complete wireless redstone access with basically an infinite amount of channels that are set by using 2 items, which I usually pick the mob drops of the spawner that I'm trying to add a channel for to not just add the link, but also label which spawner that it controls. Dripstone can be added to spawners to lower the percentage of health that a mob has when it spawns, all the way down to 20%, which allows even the tankiest of mobs to be one-hit kills without high levels of sharpness or dropping a mob a bunch of blocks. If you have an extra nether star laying around, then you can add the ignore player modifier, which removes the requirement for a player to be within 24 blocks of the spawner for it to spawn mobs. A conduit will allow the spawner to ignore spawning conditions. For example, with this modifier, this guardian spawner will still work and spawn mobs even though there's no water resource blocks, which they normally require to spawn. A Soul Lantern makes your spawner ignore lighting conditions, which means that mobs will spawn regardless of the light level. So mobs that normally need darkness can spawn in light, and vice versa, mobs that normally need light to spawn can spawn in total darkness. Chorus Fruit basically deletes the brains of spawned mobs, meaning that they won't move or attack players, but they are still affected by normal movement like gravity and conveyor belts. This modifier is especially good for server performance, since mob movement AI is one of the more computative tasks that servers constantly have to check, made worse with the large amount of mobs that you'll be spawning at a time. Wool adds the modifier Silent to your spawner, which I guess you can guess will make spawn mobs make no sounds. Youthful is a slightly evil modifier that can be added by using a turtle egg, which will spawn mobs as their baby variant whenever possible. Not really sure why you would ever want to do that, but hey, it's an option. And a Campfire is an interesting one because it adds a burning modifier, which spawns mobs that are on fire, which I guess does do some extra damage, but more importantly, that means that you can cook your mob drops. So if you have a cow spawner, instead of getting raw beef, you can now get cooked steak. And last but definitely not least, you can use up to 3 echo shards on a spawner to add echoing, which basically multiplies mob drops by the level of echoing by essentially making mob drops drop extra copies of their loot table. Putting all of these modifiers together, you can make some absolutely insane spawner setups that are borderline broken. Okay, maybe not even borderline. I recently just used this spawner setup in my ATM 10 to the Skies playthrough to farm hundreds of thousands of blaze rods, wither skeleton skulls, and prismarine shards and crystals in just a couple minutes of the spawners running. Which, hey, I guess that's a good opportunity for me to remind you to go check out my previous video, which was by far my biggest project ever, a 100 days ATM 10 to the Sky playthrough where I make the ATM star in just 100 Minecraft days. Now that I've shown you how powerful the Apotheosis Spawners can be for mobs, it's time to switch gears and start looking at ways to power up your gear. Apotheosis adds a pretty much completely reworked enchanting progression chain that not only adds a ton of new enchantments with all kinds of effects, but also more importantly gives you much more control over specific enchanting outcomes. But before getting into any of the specific new bookshelves added or some of those special enchants, let's first cover the basics. The first is, when enchanting, you can place up to 32 bookshelves or shelf variants around the enchanting table in valid bookshelf locations. Apotheosis adds a whole bunch of different types of bookshelves that have many different tiers or upgrades variations. Each shelf or item impacts the statistics of the enchanting table. There are 3 primary stats. First, Eterna, which increases the max enchantment level all the way up to 150 XP levels, basically like the enchanting power stat. Second is Quanta, which determines how random the enchantments are when rolled. And third is Arcana, which increases the chance of rare enchantments, as well as increases the chance for a higher number of enchants applied. You can always see the level of these 3 stats your enchanting setup currently has by right-clicking the enchanting table and looking at the bottom of the UI. When you hover over shelves in Apotheosis, it'll show what stat impacts the bookshelves will add to the enchantment table. And in fact, there are some items that aren't bookshelves that can still impact the stats, like candles or skeleton skulls. Now let's take a look at some of the different shelves that are available. There are really 6 main tiers that make up the progression of bookshelves that build towards the end game, allowing you to completely max out those stats. First, I guess we'll start with the vanilla shelves, the logical starting point. Nothing really special here, the shelves just give you just enough to reach that vanilla 30 level cap. The next tier is Hell Shelves, which allows you to add more Quanta and Eterna to your setup, and has a couple different variations that can be made by using your previous tier setup to infuse shelves in an enchanting table, and craft them into glowing or blazing variants. The third tier is Sea Shelves, and really you could argue that these are interchangeable in tier with the Hell Shelves because they too are more aimed at mid-game, but instead increase your Arcana and Eterna statistics instead of the Quanta from Hell Shelves. Like before, you can make some upgraded versions with Infusion, which allows you to craft Crystalline Sea Shelves and Heartforged Sea Shelves. The next tier takes you to the Deep Dark to make some Deep Shelves and Skulk Shelves. These are where you can start really cranking those stats, allowing for much higher Eternal level caps and even more powerful shelf variations like Echo or Soul Touch Deep Shelves. And the most powerful of this tier, Skulk Shelves, will require you to take down a Warden to craft. The last major tier is End Shelves, which you'll need to reach the highest enchanting levels. End Shelves can be upgraded into Pearlescent End Shelves, or the most powerful shelf available, the Draconic End Shelf, which of course gets pretty expensive to craft, requiring some end resources, but gives some crazy high stats with large Eterna and Arcana bonuses, as well as a nice boost to Quanta depending on the shelf. And the last tier is made up of the oddballs. Depending depending on the item you're trying to enchant or infuse, you sometimes need very specific statistics. So Apotheosis adds a couple shelves that help reduce certain statistics or boost very specific stats. There are many examples of these, but the main ones that I end up using are melon shelves, which reduce quanta, bee shelves, which boost quanta while negating eterna, and even those items that I mentioned earlier like mob heads, candles, and amethyst clusters, which allow you to more finely adjust or tune your shelf setups to get those stats just right. Now, with a crazy powerful enchanting setup, I guess it makes sense to look at what new enchantments and effects that you can get with Apotheosis. And while I won't cover every single enchant because there are a lot of them, I will cover the ones that I think are the most powerful and useful for your modded playthroughs. Scavenger is basically an upgraded version of looting that gives you a chance for a mob's loot table to be rolled twice when killed, with increased probability based on the enchantment level. This is super important for mobs that have capped drops, like Withers, which even with looting 3 will only drop 1 nether star. But now with Scavenger, you have the chance to get 2 wither stars from just 1 wither. Stable footing is extremely useful and removes the mining speed penalty when not on the ground, which is normally extremely annoying when you're flying around in modded Minecraft. Miner's Fervor is a polarizing one, which makes mining speed dependent on the distance to sea level. When below sea level, the mining speed is increased the farther down you go, whereas when you're above sea level, mining speed is decreased the farther up. At its max speed, this can make pickaxes way quicker than even with efficiency 5, since the maximum enchant level goes to 7. But that's of course balanced by being extremely slow if you're trying to mine anything in the sky. Tempting will cause animals to follow you while holding an item with this enchantment, similar to if you were holding its breeding item. Berserker's Fury gives you resistance, strength, and speed when you take damage at the equivalent level as the level of the enchant up to 4, as well as for an increased duration of time scaling with the enchantment level. Icy Thorns works similar to vanilla thorns, but instead of inflicting the attacker with damage, it applies slowness to the enemy with both the level and the duration of the slowness scaling with the level of the enchant. Knowledge of the Ages will actually stop mobs from dropping any items, but instead will greatly increase the amount of XP that's dropped by converting those items directly into XP at a rate of 20 times the enchantment level per item that would have been dropped. Nature's Blessing can only be applied to hoes, but allows you to right click and use your hoe as if it was bone meal, expending durability for each use. And as promised earlier, one of the most powerful enchants that is extremely useful for your mob spawner farms is Capturing, which gives mobs a chance to drop their spawn egg when taken out with a weapon with this enchant. This chance scales with the level of Capturing and works on any mob that has a spawn egg, even including mobs from other mods. Now, with so many enchants and a highly upgraded enchantment table, this makes it extremely difficult to get specific enchants on enchanted books, especially if the enchant you're looking for is only targeted for a specific tool. That's where a new item called a tome comes into place. Apotheosis adds tomes which you can craft that allow you to make enchanted books that only restricts enchants to the item category of the tome. So for instance, a Tome of the Miner would only be able to be enchanted with pickaxe enchants. Same with the Tome of Helmets, Tome of Weapons, and so on. There's also one more special tome called the Tome of Extraction, which allows you to strip specific enchants from an item when combined in an anvil to transfer them to the tome, which you can then use on whatever other item you may want. Technically not a tome, but Apotheosis adds another item called the Prismatic Cobweb, which is kind of like the Tome of Scrapping, but instead can be combined with an item in an anvil to remove curses from the item, leaving the rest of the item's enchants as is. While there are a couple more enchanting items available, I think it's best to end this section with the most powerful of all the enchanting items we've discussed, and that is none other than the Library of Alexandria. This block is basically an insanely strong infinite storage block for enchants. However, to offset this, to make this library, you need to infuse the previous tier called the Enchantment Library with a full 100% Eterna, 100% Arcana, and somewhere between 45 to 50% of Quanta. This setup can be pretty difficult and will require you going through all the full bookshelf progression that I mentioned earlier to get some skulk and end shelves, as well as some specialty shelves like melon shelves to reduce quanta. But once you have this block, you can now insert enchanted books into the library, which will convert that book into points. So for example, when I put in this sharpness 1 book, I now have 1 level of sharpness, but if I put in a sharpness 5 book, I now have 6 levels of sharpness available. You can then extract enchants by selecting the enchantment type in the GUI to generate an enchanted book with that enchant. Clicking multiple times will level up that enchanted enchanted book at the cost of those points, and shift left clicking will withdraw the maximum level available. However, it's important to note that the library keeps track of the maximum level that you've inserted for each enchantment, which means you cannot make books above that maximum level even if you have enough points. But of course, you can take 2 books out and combine them in an anvil and then export them back into the library to up that maximum level of the enchantment. Unfortunately, you cannot directly extract enchants from items into the library, or vice versa, put enchantments in the library directly on an item, but of course you can use the vanilla strats to combine an enchanted book on any item in an anvil, and you can use the tomes that we talked about earlier to target specific tool enchants and store any extras in the library for later use. So now we have some crazy mob farms and some crazy enchants to put on some gear, but I guess I'm still missing gear to put all these new enchants on, so let's see what else Apotheosis has to offer. One of my favorite parts of Apotheosis is the integration of features that it adds to enhance your normal playthrough progression. In general, as you progress in the game, Apotheosis scales the game difficulty with you. The first way it does this is with world tiers. There's a dedicated world tier menu which you can access by hitting Ctrl-T. Here you'll see that you start your journey with Haven, but there are 4 additional tiers that you can unlock: Frontier, Ascent, Summit, and Pinnacle. To activate each of these tiers, you'll have to complete a couple quests. So for example, to get to the next tier, Frontier, I'll need to equip 5 common gear pieces, a full set of armor, and a weapon of some sort. The next tier, Ascent, requires a full set of the next tier uncommon gear, as well as taking out one of the Apotheosis invaders, which I'll cover here shortly. As you increase your world tier, all kinds of enemies throughout the world will start to get stronger. But to make up for the added difficulty, you'll be rewarded with better loot. You can click the detailed info button to see your current Apotheosis loot stats. On the left panel, you'll see the loot drop chances, split into rarities for your gear as well as purities for your gems. We'll go into what these different rarities mean later, but in general, bigger percentages of the more rare tiers is better. In the first tier, there are no player or monster augments, but if we look at the info for Ascent, you'll see that another perk, along with my higher percentage of rare drops, is my player now gets 55% more XP whenever I do something in the MC world that gives me experience, as well as 30% luck when doing loot rolls throughout the world. But now I also have some new challenges, since all monsters will now have an additional 8 armor, making them much more tanky, and they'll do 5 armor pierce, which negates some of the strength of my armor. Again, I won't spoil the higher tiers and will let you explore these on your own, but Summit and Pinnacle give some really awesome player augments, but also some kind of crazy monster augments that will make even the most normal of zombies do an insane amount of damage if you aren't careful, and don't upgrade your gear to scale with your world tier. Once you've unlocked world tiers, you can always go backwards and activate a lower tier if the mobs are getting to be just a little bit too much, but you will lose your upgraded drop chances and player augments as well until you decide to reactivate the higher tier again. Now, as you're exploring the world, you may notice a slightly startling noise and a chat message about some interesting named new friend. This is the signal that one of those Apotheosis invaders I mentioned earlier has spawned. You can think of these as little mini bosses that have random spawn chances. These guys follow the same rarity tiers as gear, so green will mean uncommon, blue means rare, purple means epic, and orange means mythic. So the higher the tier, the more dangerous the mini boss. But if you're able to take them out, you are guaranteed to drop at least 1 piece of gear at the tier of the boss, which is great for getting your own Apotheosis builds going. On top of some random new friends, you also may notice some new spawners as you're exploring the world, especially in caves. These spawners, called rogue spawners, spawn slightly more challenging mobs at a faster rate than normal vanilla spawners. These guys usually aren't as challenging as the mini bosses, but of course spawn in numbers and can be good for farming some nice resources, or for stealing to make some crazy spawner setups like we talked about earlier. Getting the first set of Apotheosis gear is extremely important to get your builds going, and while taking out those mini bosses is the most sure way, technically any hostile mob killed by a player does have a chance to drop Apotheosis gear, with the rarity being determined by the world tier that we looked at earlier. Additionally, any loot chest also has the ability to contain Apotheosis gear or even gems, which is another item that we'll cover in the next section. But before we jump there is one more set of items that are a great way to farm a bunch of Apotheosis materials, and those are none other than mob gateways, which work very similar to gate pearls from the Gateways to Eternity mod. Apotheosis adds 4 craftable gate pearls, one for each of the top 4 tiers. The crafting recipes are not just gated by having that tier unlocked, but also uses items from that rarity, so you'll need to take on at least a couple of the mobs that we talked about earlier to get these gates. But once you have them, you can start a multi-wave battle that includes tons of mobs with scaling dangerous and challenging stats. But to reward each wave, you get some awesome rewards, and if you're able to complete all the waves, then you get a massive added bonus, including the chance for gear at the level above the pearl that you crafted. But if you fail any of the waves, either by getting wrecked or by running out of time, then you don't get the pearl back. So make sure you get yourself prepared before trying one of these out. You can always check the list of mobs included in each wave, any stats or effects those mobs will have, as well as the rewards by hovering over the pearl and pressing shift. And you can scroll to switch between each of the waves so you know exactly what you're getting yourself into. Now that we have some starter gear, let's take a look at how gear stats work in a little bit more detail, as well as the different systems Apotheosis adds for upgrading and making some insanely powerful builds. Similar to Enchanting, Apotheosis adds a fully revamped gear system that adds a super interesting progression system, allowing you to upgrade and fully customize the stats of your weapons, tools, and armor. All Apotheosis gear stats can be broken down into two categories. The first is the affixes. You can think of these as the base set of stats and perks that more or less set Apotheosis gear apart. As we looked at earlier, there are 5 tiers of affixes, and the higher your world tier or boss level, the more likely you are to get better affixes. And of course, as the rarity increases, the level of traits will become better as well. Affixes can take the form of stat bonuses shown in blue text like extra attack damage, additional armor, or even creative flight, as well as effects shown in yellow, with a couple examples being a % chance to ignore durability damage and potion effect gains or casts. You'll only start seeing effects on gear that is tier rare or higher, and unlike the 1 to 2 stat bonuses in common or uncommon gear, you'll start to see 3 or 4 in the rare, epic, and mythic. Now, as you get to those higher rarity tiers, you'll also notice something new on your gear, and that's gem sockets, which I guess is a great segue to the second category of stat effects. As you're exploring the world and taking on mobs and bosses, you'll start to pick up gems. Gems provide a configurable way to add a very specific perk onto your gear. You attach gems to your gear in a smithing table, but of course to add a gem you need an empty gem slot. And once you put a gem on something, you can't take it off, so choose your gear and gem combos carefully. In the current version of Apotheosis, there are 31 total gem types, and when you hover over each gem, you'll see that it shows a whole bunch of information. The first thing to note is that gems can usually only be attached to certain types of gear, and the gear you attach the gem to may have different effects. So for example, this tyrannical gem gives armor toughness on core armor, which is chest plates and leggings, but gives a max health % increase on boots, or the gem of the earth, which adds fortune levels to mining tools, but additional protection levels to core armor. But in addition to the gem type, there is that same group of rarity tiers, except this time there's actually one additional tier past mythic called flawless. As a gem goes up in rarity, the stat impacts also increase. It's important to note though that the rarity does not change what stacks or effects that the gem type has or what items it can be attached to. Instead, the rarity only increases the stat amounts, percentages, or levels. So looking at one of the stats of the solar gem, or the cracked solar gem, you get an additional 0.25 step height, but that increases to half a block at chipped, 1 block at flawed, 1.5 at the epic level, 2 blocks at flawless, and 3 at perfect. As I mentioned earlier, you can get most of these gems from exploring and taking out mobs, but there are a couple in here that can only drop when killing mobs in certain dimensions. Gem of the Earth and Royal Family are only found in the overworld. Incandescent Inferno and Ravenous Bloodlord are found in the Nether, and arguably the most powerful Mage Slayer and the Ender Surge gems are found in the end. Now there's a whole lot of gems, so I won't go through all of them, but I will highlight a couple that I think are super powerful and I usually am on the lookout for. In general, for me, the power of Apotheosis gems is percentage increases, because these scale insanely well, especially when you have a large affix roll. For instance, a 40% increase on a base of 200 hearts is way more than just adding a flat 12 hearts. So the gem of the Ravenous Bloodlord has a 60% attack damage increase on helmets. Gem of the Samurai has a 50% crit chance increase on weapons. The Brawler's gem has 50% attack speed and plus 12 max health on armor, and 30% on shields. Gem of the Warlord, which adds 70% crit damage and 35% max health. And then the big boys, the Gem of the Earth, which adds up to 4 levels of either sharpness, protection, or fortune, which does stack on top of normal enchant caps, and the Ender Surge gem, which adds 2 levels to all existing enchants on any tool, which is crazy. Of course, the gems that you're trying to get will drastically change depending on the type of build that you're going for, and additionally, the affixes that are already included on your gear may change the type of build that you want to put together. There really is a basically infinite amount of super powerful combinations that you can put together to do some crazy things. Like in my recent FTB Skies 2 playthrough, I was able to get up to almost 2,000 hearts, or in my ATM 10 TTS playthrough, playthrough, I was able to one-shot a Warden or Ender Dragon, but I'm sure even I have only just started scratching the surface, so I would love to hear about your crazy builds that you've put together, either in the YouTube comments, or you should totally join my community Discord channel, where you can share your builds, or join in on the conversation of all kinds of modded Minecraft craziness. Now we've covered the main systems of Apotheosis gear, but we aren't done yet, because this mod also adds some new tables and items that help you configure this gear even further. As I mentioned earlier, each of the rarities has an associated item that you could get from those mob gates, but you can also get by scrapping unwanted Apotheosis gear. That's where the Salvaging table comes into play, which you can either pipe in or manually insert gear to get between 1 and 4 of its associated material. For common gear, that gives you mysterious scrap metal, uncommon gives time-worn fabric, rare gives luminous crystal shards, epic gives arcane sands, and last but certainly not least, the highest tier mythical gives god-forged pearls. You can also scrap unwanted gems, but instead of getting any of those materials, you get a new item called gem dust. There is no different rarity tiers of gem dust, but instead the amount you get scales with the rarity of the gem. So common gems only give 1 to 2 dust, but perfect gems will give between 5 and 10. Now with both gem dust and some rarity materials, you can start using the next Apotheosis table called the gem cutting station. This station allows you to increase the tier of your gems by sacrificing 2 gems of the same rarity, as well as some gem dust and rarity materials. The cost depends on the rarity that you're trying to upgrade to and are shown either in JEI or in the table itself once you insert your 2 gems. You can also use gem dust to make an important base crafting resource called gem fused slate, which is required for the next group of Apotheosis items that we'll look at, Sigils. By default, Apotheosis adds 5 different craftable sigils that give you all kinds of customization ability for your gear. The first is the Sigil of Socketing, which you can use on your gear in a smithing table to add unused gem slots. Unfortunately, this doesn't allow you to go over the max of 3 slots per item, but it does give you the ability to use gems on lower tier gear, or completely max out gear that may have rolled great affixes but low roll on sockets. The Sigil of Withdrawal also frees up your gear sockets, but in the opposite way. This sigil will remove all socketed gems without damaging the item, which is great for late game to make way for the highest tier gems without having to remake all your gear from scratch. One thing you'll notice is Apotheosis gear obtained from looting or mobs usually has some pretty crazy names that may not quite fit your vibe. That's where you can use the Sigil of Unnaming to return the gear to its normal item name, and make way for you to rename the gear to whatever you want. The last 2 sigils, the Rebirth and an Enhancement, aren't used directly on gear, but are instead used on the other 3 Apotheosis workstations that we haven't looked at yet, which hey, I guess that's a good segue to go ahead and check them out. First, the simple Reforging table. This table uses the rarity materials from earlier as well as Sigils of Rebirth to re-roll Apotheosis gear. When forging, you'll get 3 options at 3 different tiers, with the amount of materials and sigils increasing with the higher tiers. But the beauty of this table, other than that spamming hammer sound, is that you can roll unaffixed items as well to give them Apotheosis stats. So that means not just your own vanilla tools, but pretty much any modded gear can also be apothesized to take it to the next level. It is important to note though that the simple Reforging table will only let you forge items up to the rare tier. If you want the upper tiers, then you'll need to upgrade that simple table into the Reforging table, which works exactly the same way but now gives you access to all 5 different rarities for forging. The final table we'll look at is the Augmentation table. This one gives you much finer control in your gear with the ability to upgrade or even completely re-roll specific affixes. But I'll warn you now, these augments come at a great cost, both in terms of using those sigils of enhancement, but also even more levels of XP, sometimes even requiring 200 plus levels to do a single action. So you'll definitely want to get some good mob farms going with those spawners earlier to farm as much XP as possible. When you put a piece of gear into the table, you'll see a drop down that lists out all the affixes of your gear, including both the stats and the effects. Clicking on each, you'll see your current roll, so in this case 21% armor, as well as the possible range of that affix at that current tier. So my 21% is pretty much right in the middle of the 15 to 30% range. On the left, I have the ability to upgrade that affix and get closer to that 30% max, but this costs 2 sigils of enhancement and 225 experience levels. Or if there's an affix that I don't really like for me this gravitational, which is pretty annoying in my opinion, I can instead use the right button to completely reroll the affix and try to get something different. This is usually a little less expensive exclusive, in this case only taking 1 sigil and 175 XP levels. There have been a lot of different mods over the years that have different takes on reworking the gear system in Minecraft, and honestly, Apotheosis takes the cake for my favorite so far. Not only is the progression climb super fun, but the mix of rarity and achievement when you get good gear, as well as the endgame ability to refine and focus your gear just right, feels so satisfying. And of course, the mod is extremely configurable, allowing modpack makers to balance or gate certain features to match the modpack progression, or even add additional or integrate other abilities and effects from other mods. Now that we are all fully geared up, it's time to switch gears a little bit and look at some of the different quality of life features and additions Apotheosis adds. While we've covered the most powerful features added by Apotheosis, there are still some miscellaneous items that deserve some attention. First, if you've ever played vanilla Minecraft, then you know that trying to get a Trident can be extremely painful, especially if you're like me and super unlucky. That's where the Inert Trident helps out, since you can craft it with some C ingredients that are a little bit easier to get more of. Then by using a medium tier enchanting setup, you can infuse that Inert Trident into an actual Trident for all your yeeting needs. The next group of items is the Ender Leads. The starting point is the flimsy Ender Lead, which is craftable with some easy vanilla items. This lead lets you pick up and move passive animals wherever you want, very similar to the mob catcher from Just Dire Things, except the flimsy Ender Lead has a very small durability of only 8 uses. Luckily, with an enchanting setup, you can infuse the flimsy version to the next tier, the normal Ender Lead, which along with greatly increasing the durability to 64 uses, now has the ability to move around pretty much any mob, including hostile mobs, but still can't move the Ender Dragon. One more infusion with a captured witch and an even higher level enchanting table gives you an occult Ender Lead, which has an infinite durability. However, the key feature with this max version is that when you pick up a mob, the occult Ender Lead will act as a mob egg, allowing you to change mob spawners to that mob. Thanks to the double infusion layout requirement, this is a little harder than just getting capturing in my opinion, and much harder than if you have mob grinding utils. But if you're making a bunch of farms with tons of spawners, then this could be a good option since it's reusable. Apotheosis also adds a couple new potion recipes for a bunch of vanilla effects that you normally don't have a way to make. Starting with some effects that you can usually only get from beacons like Resistance, which you can make with a shulker shell, Absorption, which you can get with a golden apple, and Haste, which you can get with mushroom soup. While those potions are all pretty nice, especially if you're doing some work outside of your base, there are a couple more negative ones, like a potion that gives a wither effect by brewing using a wither skeleton skull, or even a mining fatigue potion, which you get by putting a fermented spider eye on one of those potions of haste from earlier. Just like vanilla potions, you can make splash, lingering, or even tipped arrow versions of these potions to use on other mobs, or maybe even for use in custom maps or minigames. There is one more vanilla effect potion which you can get by putting a fermented spider eye on a potion of slow fall, which makes a potion of levitation. This is the same effect that you normally would get when being hit by a shulker, which is usually pretty annoying. However, this potion is extremely important, not necessarily for direct use, but because you can then brew it again with a popped chorus fruit to turn it into a potion of flight, which gives you creative flight for the duration of the potion. And with some redstone, you can make the potion last up to 30 minutes, which is pretty crazy for a single use. But that'll get even crazier when we look at another item that Apotheosis adds. But before that, there are a couple more non-vanilla effect potions that are available. The first two are positive: Bursting Vitality made from sweet berries that make any type of player healing more efficient, and Ancient Knowledge made from a bottle of enchanting, which gives huge increases to the amount of XP your player gains whenever doing a task that gains experience. There's also two negative potions: Grievous Wounds, which is the opposite of Bursting Vitality, made with a fermented spider eye to instead decrease healing efficiency, and Sundering, which is the opposite of Resistance, made again with a fermented spider eye to make you more susceptible to taking damage. It's also important to note that all of these potion effects, along with the vanilla potion effects, are things you may see in the effect slots on your Apotheosis gear that we looked at earlier. Positive potion effects will be applied to your player depending on the condition the gear rolls, and negative effects will be applied to enemies that either hit you or you hit, again depending on the gear roll. Now, potions are great, but honestly, I very rarely use them when playing vanilla or much less modded, because it's kind of annoying to always be stuck making them and remembering to drink them to keep your effect going. But Apotheosis solves that problem by introducing a new item called a charm, which is crafted with some blaze powder and 3 of the same type potion. The charms almost work like a mini beacon on the go, allowing you to activate the effect of whatever potion used when right-clicking it. It'll continue to work as long as you have it in your inventory or even a bauble slot until you disable it by right-clicking again, or until it runs out of durability, which you will notice has a default of 192 durability and loses 1 durability about every 8 seconds. So that solves my first problem with potions, having to drink them to keep them going, but not my second problem, having to continually make more. Of course, Apotheosis has a fix for that too, by allowing you to infuse them with a maxed out Eterna enchanting setup to make the charm completely unbreakable with infinite durability, which is not just great for things like haste or absorption, but that flight potion from earlier means if you aren't lucky enough to get creative flight on your Apotheosis gear, you can supplement it with an infinite flight charm for all your exploring and building needs. We made it! All of the major Apotheosis items and mechanics covered in just under 40 minutes. This mod is such a fun change of pace from so many others out there, with its RPG-style gear system and countless features that still keep that classic vanilla vibe. But the best part, it's still being actively updated, so who knows what the future versions might bring. If you found this episode of Mod Labs helpful, or if it gave you some inspiration for your next modded playthrough, be sure to hit that like button. It really helps me out a lot. Or if you have any questions, crazy gem combos, or even feedback for the channel, drop a comment below. I try my best to read every single one. And hey, if you want to keep up with all the latest Minecraft mods and mod packs, definitely consider subscribing so you don't miss the next Mod Labs episode. Now that you've seen everything Apotheosis can do, I think we can all agree that this mod is super fun and lets you make some insane gear that's totally 100% balanced. As long as that 2000 damage sword isn't being used against you.